Hello, I'm Amy Busey from Cadre, a resource network for the National Science Foundation's DRK-12 program. And today I'm talking with Dennis Schatz and Dr. Rabiah about connecting in and out of school STEM learning. Dennis Schatz is a senior fellow at Institute for Learning Innovation, retiring president of NSTA, inaugural field editor of NSTA's Connected Science Learning Journal, and a former NSF program director. Rabiah is the Davie Vice President of Education at the Museum of Science and Industry, Chicago. She is also currently a co-PI on CASE, the resource network for projects funded by NSF's Advancing Informal STEM Learning program. Thank you both so much for being here today. The DRK-12 program primarily funds research and development in formal education settings. So I'm wondering if we could start by talking a little bit about what's sometimes referred to as the STEM learning ecosystem. So what is that ecosystem? And what kinds of informal environments and experiences are included in it?
Fundamentally, the learning ecosystem states that learning happens everywhere. So it certainly happens in schools, so like K-12, but it happens in museums, it happens after school, happens at home, pick any environment, at church on the weekend. And so the goal of the ecosystem is to think about ways in which you integrate, connect all of those different locations. So it is really important to think beyond the formal classroom. Too often, I know when I talk to people about science, when learning in science or in STEM, they say, oh, in school I did this, but it's not where it all happens. And if you look at the research done by people like Anna Maltese and Rob Tai, it comes out dramatically that if you look at where people their interest and enthusiasm about science or STEM, it really comes in all these different places. So the key thing is, how do we bridge between all of the different places?
And I think one of the really exciting things about the STEM ecosystem, as somebody who grew up and followed a path into science, is that even though that terminology didn't exist 30 years ago, for example, when I was a child, we absolutely lived that experience, right? That there's museums on the weekends and classroom during the school day and talking with your family members in the car. And so it's really nice to see that we now have a really modern model that validates that everyday learning and everyday environments approach for in school and out of school.
So when we think about formal and informal contexts, what assets do they each bring to this learning ecosystem? And what do we gain by making connections between them?
So that's a big question that I think that, I will certainly say that when I first started in the informal science learning field, which was about now 13 or so years ago, there was this very hard distinction between formal and informal. And to some extent, I think that persists. But that formal was where all the rules were, right? Curriculum and learning standards, and informal was where all the fun was, right? And that kind of distinction, I think, which is really not true. High quality instruction is all of those things, right? It involves standards and learning progressions and fun and excitement and engagement. But I do think that there are some differences that each of those environments certainly can bring to the ecosystem. And so, for example, one of the things we know from the formal context, so in school, in the K-12 environment, are things like strong and consistent curriculum, the ability to have differentiated instruction, the supports of an institution, a series of teachers and administrators in a district. We also know that the formal environment brings with it additional supports that may not be STEM related, but we know are really important to supporting a young person's learning trajectory, whether that's counseling support or individual education plans, et cetera. But what I think is really important to note is that the informal learning environment really has done quite a bit of that, just in different ways. So when we think about after school and the fact that our after school educators, be they at faith-based organizations or museums or other youth-serving organizations, they know our young people really well. But what I think they can also add is an area of cultural competency, right? We know from the data that the educators in our after-school environments are much more likely to have racial and socioeconomic similarities to the learners than perhaps in the classroom. That's particularly true for racial minorities in this country. Some of those relationships in informal spaces are long-term. You might have a young person who's in an environment for years and years, and their siblings go through the same program, and that's a little different from what happens in the school environment. So when we think about integrating those two from both the level of the educators and curriculum and the experiences of the young people, there's a real opportunity to connect curriculum with culture, lived experience and practical application of science to content and instruction in some really meaningful ways.
Well, boy, you've articulated it extremely well. I think the biggest thing really comes back to this idea that what gets an interest and learning, not just an interest, but learning, happens for people in many different ways. And it's for some at school. I mean, I think all of us made it through the school system pretty well, or we wouldn't be where we are. And so we were able to attend to that. But a lot of people don't find that the best learning experience. So how do we make it so that we provide many different kinds of learning experience that deal with the cultural competency aspect, that certainly deal with the content and the concepts. I mean, as they're all important too. But we need to be able to connect them if we really want to have an impact. I mean, I always, and people have heard me before, I have this great statement that, you know, my goal in life is for science to be as pervasive as sports. You know, and we know we've made it when people get to rush home to Monday Night Science. And I think of that as a great metaphor in terms of what happens in sports is that there's, you know, sports in school, there's after school sports. You go out to the playground on the weekend and play catch with your kids. And it's that same kind of, you need to have it found everywhere in your life in order to make it pervasive. Yeah. So we need to think about that if we really want to have the impact that we all hope to have.
So you mentioned connections to students' culture and their communities and providing a variety of different experiences that might better support different kinds of learners. Are there any other assets or connections or ways that those can help support and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Maybe I'm not the best person to answer, but I think what Rabiah said is about in terms of having connections to people that are a lot like you. The cultural competency, actually, the cultural connections is absolutely critical. And so if you want to focus on equity, diversity, then you need to think about ways of making that happen, whether it's in school or it's after school or in, you know, your place of worship or wherever it may be. It's critical for people to see there are individuals who I identify with who are doing the kinds of things that interest me.
I think one of the areas of interest, and if I can, you know, share an example from the Museum of Science and Industry, one of our approaches over a decade ago in supporting the after school, out of school learning environment was really looking at where young people are already in the out of school time, right? And this, I should say, is not unique to our museum. It's the one that I'll highlight for the moment. But the idea that we knew after school, students were at their after school organizations. They were at their Boys and Girls Clubs or their YMCAs or their faith-based organizations. And what those providers needed was some STEM enrichment, right? And so I think in thinking about how we can leverage what is already being done incredibly well in our neighborhoods and our communities, where there are trusted relationships with people, not just with cultural competency, but similar cultural backgrounds and lived experiences that don't set up the kinds of inequities that can happen when that's not the case. How do we enrich those environments with really rich STEM learning, whether it's capacity building for educators or activities and programs for young people? I think that's one of the ways that informal and formal partnerships and programs in general can really elevate and validate the neighborhood and community-based learning that happens all the time, right? Young people are learning in those environments, as Dennis said earlier, all of the time. And so if the question is, how do we support STEM learning in those environments? Many times it's not creating a brand new system or environment. It's really, how do we enrich STEM in some of those environments? And so when I think, as we're talking about issues of equity and inclusion, going to existing models and platforms for young people who are engaging in meaningful ways, in equitable, culturally relevant ways, is one of, it's a powerful approach that is, we're seeing that nationwide. Again, I'm just using our programs with our after school science clubs as an example, but again, it is a tremendous way of not reinventing the wheel, if you will, and really attending to some of those issues of equity in a very hyper-local, neighborhood-focused way.
So when you think about effective formal and informal partnerships, are there features or processes you think contribute to their success?
So I will say, having, full transparency, having, I think, been a part of some successful partnerships and some less than successful partnerships, I think it's important to acknowledge that there can often be an imbalance of power and agency in those relationships, right? So this often happens, especially if one organization is smaller in size, in budget, in scope. So I think having a partnership that has real attention to an acknowledgement of the equity and power differentials that might exist is incredibly important in any partnership, but certainly as we're thinking about formal and informal. But also some fundamentals, I think, of partnership in general that we see play out in this work. The STEM ecosystems landscape is a really great example of when there are shared goals and shared priorities for an ecosystem, for example, or a formal informal partnership, that those tend to be more successful rather than having competing and perhaps unseen goals and priorities. And I would also mention, and this is something that we talk quite a lot about at CASE and certainly elsewhere, is approaching partnerships from an asset-based perspective, right? So thinking, for example, that for us as a museum, if we were to approach a school partner or a district from a deficit-based perspective, assuming what's missing, what don't they have that we need to provide, versus recognizing the strength and the power of schools and teachers and school districts, and how do we elevate and leverage that with our resources and value to create additional value for our learners, is incredibly important as well. So seeing the assets in both partners, recognizing, validating, and elevating those, I think is really important for respectful and sustainable relationships. What about you, Dennis?
Well, yeah, I think, again, Rabiah has outlined it very nicely. I often think about co-creation as a critical element of it. I know early in my career, we had was an NSF grant, community leadership, and we were coming in, and it really was a deficit model. We'll come in and work with after-school community and give them STEM activities and so on. And it really was us coming saying, we've got the answer here, why don't you take it? And I think that was an aha moment for me to realize that all the things that Rabiah brought up in terms of what needs to be done, I think of it as this co-creation. You need to come together. You need to see each other's assets. You need to look at making sure it's a win-win, that the benefit, there's a benefit for both groups. So how do you make sure that happens? Otherwise, it's likely to fail, and which will end up with some hard feelings.
You remind me of something, Dennis, as I was thinking. I sometimes have experienced, and again, full transparency, I've done this myself. We can learn a lot from reading articles and proposals and being a part of projects, but I also think there is nothing like seeing learning happen in the moment. And so if for myself as an informal educator, going to a school and going to a classroom as part of our partnership development with formal partners is incredibly valuable. I would argue necessary, right? You can only learn so much from a report or an article, but seeing
Absolutely.
what teachers are doing, the challenges they're having, the responses from their students, the support of their administrators is critically important. And I would say vice versa. Someone on the formal side needs to be in that informal environment and observing what learning is happening, where some of those challenges are, and to really have firsthand experience to inform the kind of partnership work they would do together.
Where can one find programs that demonstrate effective formal and informal collaborations, and what kind of work needs to be done to identify those and disseminate information about them?
Well, I certainly have to take this opportunity to promote Connected Science Learning, which you mentioned that I was the inaugural field editor of. I've now left that as I became president of NSTA. I couldn't be both. But Connected Science Learning's whole purpose is to demonstrate, put out there for people to see both the research and the programs that exemplify good collaboration between in-school and out-of-school STEM programs. And it's easy enough. The easiest way is to Google Connected Science Learning. Otherwise, you can go to nsta.org/CSL, and that'll take you there. But we have about 12 articles a year, and we solicit all over the country and actually internationally. And we're always looking for good manuscripts. And I know a number of cadre, actually a number of iTest and AZEL projects that have been funded by NSF have been highlighted there. But it's a great resource to see what are people doing and is this something that I can do in my own area. So I certainly think that's a good place to have a kind of a national view of what's out there. But I think the other opportunity is really to go out. It's kind of what Rabiah was saying, go out and interact with your community. Go talk to, if you're a formal person, you go out and talk to the different out of school activities that are happening and vice versa, and find locally what people are doing to figure out how you connect. The biggest thing is to come in with a mindset or start the mindset as I want to do something that connects informal and formal. And once you do that, then you can, and then you have the right mindset to go out and try and find the right connections.
I want to echo what Dennis, what you were saying about going out. I think, you know, if there's a theme I would love to get out there, it's just the importance of being present and taking the time to really learn and see what's happening in the community of interest. But I think also to recognize that, you know, we have these great platforms for, you know, federally funded projects to be highlighted and represented. Connected Science Learning is a fantastic resource for our community. The Cadre website, the CASE website, informalscience.org has, you know, really exciting examples of projects that are demonstrating these kinds of partnerships. And also there are the small, you know, so-called mom and pop neighborhood kind of very grassroots developed initiatives that are impressive and powerful and having impact in ways that I think to some extent larger organizations like big museums can only hope to have in the lives of young people. So I echo the notion of not being limited to just, you know, the funded, very visible projects, but really learning about what has been happening at the grassroots level, at the family level, in many cases for generations. Go ahead.
I tell you, one of the challenges you bring up is it relates to kind of the researcher, the people that have the NSF projects and these, I don't know, mom and pop, but the things that are happening out with the practitioners. Practitioners have no need to be to publish, where typically the people running NSF grants, they feel the need to publish. And so what you get out there is a lot of research results, but what you don't really get is publications and other mechanisms, whether it's webinars like this or other vehicles by which you learn about effective programs that aren't necessarily funded and focusing on this whole publication. Of course, that was really the hope with Connected Science Learning, and you bring up informalscience.org. It's a great resource to go and find those things that don't necessarily get recorded in the research journals or somebody feels they have to publish. I wish we could figure out a way to give more credit, I guess if that's the right word, credit to practitioners who will be who do more marketing about what they do.
I agree with that fully. And I know, you know, one of my, certainly since the pandemic started, one of my newer go-tos for finding, in particular, informal STEM learning programs and initiatives is actually Instagram. And that I think is largely because of, again, the kind of grassroots, it's really, there's an organizing kind of spirit and mentality about a lot of this work, right? We have a critical issue facing our young people. There is a social justice element connected to it. We need to galvanize our resources around supporting these young people. And I have been floored by what I've been able to see and find and contribute to and collaborate on, literally just from scrolling through Instagram. And so one of the questions, you know, that I think we might pose is, to what extent are the things that we might traditionally see as valuable, publication, being featured on a website, be valuable to some of those other communities and programs. And if it's not publication or feature on a website, what are the mechanisms of, to your point, getting the word out and publicity for them? Because I think there's a lot more we can do there. But our so-called traditional social media channels are like rich with some really exciting projects. Sometimes you scroll through things and you want to reach out and say there would be a great ASL proposal. And I'm like, I don't know if they want to write a proposal for the NSF. That may not be what they're interested in, right? That's my assumption. But it seems like there's definitely some connection we can make there.
I'm glad you brought up Instagram and social media, because I was wondering as you were talking, here we are in the pandemic. Do you have any other suggestions for how people might go out there and see what's happening when so much of everything is happening virtually right now?
Yes. So I think there are things that I think are fascinating that perhaps fall outside of the traditional STEM learning context, right? So when I think about mutual aid, right, which has always been happening generations upon generations, this idea of communities coming together and supporting each other with the things that they need based on what they've identified as a need, whether that's food, housing, transportation, childcare, et cetera. We saw an incredible rise in both, I think, the visibility, but certainly just the amount of mutual aid as a result of the pandemic, right? People losing their jobs, having childcare challenges, remote learning for schools, et cetera. And what I think has been much less visible is that STEM learning has been integrated into many of those efforts, right? People who care about young people and communities recognize that young people need outlets for play and for engagement and for connecting with content that's relevant and exciting to them, and hands-on activities and exploring the world around them. And I live in Chicago, and I would say Chicago is, it's a large, diverse city where the mutual aid here is pretty fantastic, often organized by young people, parents, neighborhood, really just foundational folks in the neighborhood. And so I am really struck by, I think, the opportunity that presents for us to look deeper in those spaces and how we can elevate and support them, right? It may not appear to be STEM learning at the kind of external level, but young people who are being supported by organizations to help with their remote learning in pods for families, for example, that don't have resources to hire private teachers, they're looking for STEM content and activities, and they're finding their way for those young people, right? So I think the pandemic has called attention to so much, as we know, of the persistent inequities that exist in our society, the persistent inequities that exist in education, in particular STEM education, but more broadly. So I am really excited and curious about how we can better support those kinds of efforts without taking them over, right? Because they have beautiful identity and culture on their own that does not need one of our large institutions to swoop in and kind of take it over or fix it, but rather how can we be meaningful background supporters and partners to that kind of work? But it might look like nutrition and physical space and housing support as well as STEM learning. So I think that's one of the questions that this pandemic is really going to continue to push us to ask, and I hope that we will show up as a community with some compelling answers.
And I think we see that the pandemic has democratized STEM learning in a way. By necessity, it's not happening has to happen in schools. It's happening elsewhere. The parents, other agencies, the kinds of things that Rabiah talked about have had to fill some of that gap. And I think that's, in many ways, even before the pandemic, that's what the whole idea of the ecosystem is talking about. How do we make it so we think about learning happening in many places, and how do we encourage that? Because I think it's absolutely critical that we figure out a way to make that happen, even after the pandemic. How do we and how do we recognize that STEM learning isn't thought about in the traditional sense? I still remember Phil Bell's whole work with this one student who was doing, she was making perfumes at home, I think. And but her teacher felt she wasn't doing very well in a chemistry unit that they were doing. I think it was a middle school. And so here you have at home doing something that is very much similar to what would have been an academic area, where the teacher didn't think the person was doing very well, but was applying the kinds of strategies and learning that you want to have happen at a project at home. But no one would have probably said, oh, well, that's, that's science thinking, that's STEM thinking, that's doing chemistry. So we need to break down those barriers to think about what STEM learning looks like and where it can happen.
I appreciate that. Dennis, as you were talking, I was thinking about some work from Edna Tan and Angie Calabrese-Barton on this notion of that they frame as rightful presence. And, this, I'm really compelled by that, I think, as kind of the challenge from a social justice perspective to so-called traditional models of inclusion, right? So, how do we shift in STEM learning away from a model of inclusion that invites people, if you will, to come into an existing context for learning that has largely been developed, defined, established, and maintained by a majority, a dominant, I would say, dominant population, if you will, to shifting our thinking and our understanding of how people can and should learn in these environments in a way that not only welcomes, but actually designs with those cultural differences and backgrounds and experiences in mind, right? So that young people can show up as their full selves, to have high quality learning experiences in STEM, and to challenge, first to acknowledge, and then to challenge and disrupt, right? The kinds of inequities that exist in science learning, right? Because they do, both in informal and formal contexts. And so I think I think that we will have missed a huge opportunity if this moment of pandemic and social and political uprising does not shift our collective thinking about how we treat and incorporate social justice issues in STEM learning, and how we can do better, do it differently, do it more deeply, do it better for to the benefit of our students.
I mean, I think we see the same thing happening, I'll say, within the scientific area. I'm thinking of even science education research. It's one thing to deal with education at the K-12 level or after school or whatever, but certainly, in terms of inviting people in, that's what we do. We say, okay, you can be part of the science education world or the scientific world if you do it our way.
That's right. That's right.
Not that we need to have some constraints. It can't be, well, anyways, okay, but it's still not very inviting. So if we really want to have a broader STEM workforce, if you want to put it in a very practical sense, then you need to figure out a way for it not to be a deficit model, which is really what that is. Well, these people don't have these skills. Here's what they need in order to be like us. How do we figure out a way in which we can broaden the arena for everybody to participate in and participate in an effective way?
Yeah. And I honestly, I will say that I think, again, just because I work in a museum, I think museums have not often thought that they fall, they experience and replicate those same dynamics, right? It's different, but certainly you come into a museum, we have a designed experience where we are expecting people to engage in a particular way, whether it's a program or an exhibition. And I think while there's been absolute movement towards being more mindful of our different audiences and what they come in with and how we can support very personalized and individualized experiences, there is still work to do around challenging some of those norms. What does it mean to come to a museum? What does it mean to feel welcome and that you belong in a museum? We're doing some exciting studies on that right now at our institution. And again, I think that this particular time is calling virtually everything in society to account for its role in either maintaining the status quo or pushing against it. So this idea of returning to normal, I think many people have said, self-included, that normal wasn't so great for everybody. And so how does this moment force us to both be accountable to ourselves and each other, but to make the kind of changes that we know can be incredibly impactful for all of our learners. So I think that's incredibly exciting and scary and difficult and all the things, but we cannot afford to waste this moment.
And, you know, I think another thing for me that's really important is we often think about how do we affect the learner. And in this case, since we're dealing with cadre, you know, the K-12 learner, what are the program, even after school, how do we affect what happens after school for K-12? And I think we miss out in that it's not just programs or efforts with them, it's how do we build relationships with the people that have influence on those. And I mean, whether it's teachers, we do a lot with teachers, but with families, caregivers, peers, how do we build those relationships, which we know from the learning ecosystem are really important, and in many ways, especially before the 8th grade, are even more important than teachers.
That's right.
So we need to think more broadly than I think we have done. This comes back to a question I know we're going to get into in terms of the gap in the research. I think this is one of the areas that really needs to be looked at.
That was a good segue.
It is. Thank you, Dennis. So yes, my next question is, as you think about the future and the work that's needed in this area, what gaps do you see in the research on informal and formal connections? Were there opportunities for the CASE community, the cadre, the DRK-12 community, and other communities to help advance the field?
Well, of course, I will start with, since I said that before, I think that's a big area that's really important. I think the biggest thing for me over the years, to a large extent, is that the researchers, going back to an earlier comment, they're the big gorilla. And the practitioners tend to be maybe it's the mice, I'm not sure. I don't want to pick on that analogy too much, but it's still, they have to deal with the big gorillas, and it's the researcher who directs it and is in control. And one of the things I think that really needs to move is to really focus on practitioner needs, practitioner involvement. There's certainly been a lot more of research practitioner collaboration lately, but how do we move that even further to get the practitioner really influencing the research that will inform what practitioners need to know in order to do their job better. So that's one of the biggest areas that I think is important.
I agree. I was thinking as you were talking about a guidebook that was released, I think it might have been last year or perhaps the year before, that was from Chicago Beyond, that was entitled, "Why Am I Always Being Researched?" And it was a guidebook specifically to really help, you know, researchers and practitioners to really, I think, acknowledge some of the challenges and inequities really of the kind of research that is often done, social science and education research that's done. This is not STEM specific, but I think it really applies to this context, to minoritized and marginalized populations who are quite literally always being studied, right? But are not typically participating in the studies in an active kind of level playing field way, who often don't have a say in the kinds of questions that are being asked or what value the research has to them as a community. And so I think what I'm inspired by is I think the shift that we're seeing in, again, back to our earlier discussion about successful partnerships, having some shift between, I think, researchers and practitioners, be they formal or informal, you know, not having that gorilla kind of dynamic, but in fact, you know, understanding and developing research questions together, right? Asking questions of young people themselves. What matters to you? What do you care about? What are the kinds of things that you're interested in? And actually meaningfully have that inform the work. I think people who've been doing participatory action research for years know how to do this well, but I think that is a space where we continue to see some meaningful gaps in the STEM literature. So I would really love to see more of that. As in particular, as it relates to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, those youth in their communities, again, to have, people have a voice. I learned this from Megan Bang, right? People have a voice. It's a matter of, you know, who is listening to the voice. And so making sure that we're creating the appropriate spaces that those voices are listened to as it relates to the development of programming and the research that gets published and ultimately is the foundation for our field.
And I have to mention in this arena right now, the NSF just funded a conference proposal for connected science learning to bring together a group of researchers, practitioners to talk about what are the gaps, what are the way in which we can highlight more the effective programs and strategies in bridging between in-school and out-of-school. And that study group has finished meeting, but there will be calls for contributions and contributed and invited contributions to connected science learning that will come out during the coming year that will really highlight some of these things. And we'll look at some of these gaps and highlight those also.
Rabiah, Dennis, thank you so much for your time.